join me in welcoming Stephen Morrow.
We might have to butter the doors so I can get my head out. Thank you so much, Dunham, for the introduction. And thank you all for coming out on a rainy Monday afternoon. It's Monday evening, which we're on about whatever I'm going to, which we're on about shortly. I've already done an introduction. The only thing that I might add to that is that a long career in T before I got curious about leadership and organizations, and that's kind of what I do now. What I wrote my book about, and then what I'm going to talk to you about is some of the conclusions from. So hopefully there's something that all of you will take out of the conversation tonight, and I will certainly at the end, something particularly learning. Chance you might forget it. Wow. I think I might just get going. Okay, with you, as I say, I think I probably explains what I am and what I'm on about as I get into it. So, my own journey into leadership began sort of in this place. That wasn't me in a past life, but rather that's the sort of version of leadership. When I had my first management position, that's sort of what I understood leadership. Red cape on shoulders flapping in the wind, troops behind you, off you go into sort of distance. And that sort of made some sense to me, or rather that was an explanation to me, because when you consider the average employee salary, they're represented by that one little green dot. When the average FTSE CEO earns 120 times that, and the Standard & Poor's 285 times that in the US, maybe those leaders must know something, right? They've got to be sort of amazing, incredible people. But then as you take your first job, you realize that actually a lot of what you're doing when you're a leader, don't worry about the text in there, but a lot of what you're doing is very bureaucratic. You spend an awful lot of time in spreadsheets, a good amount of time inside PowerPoint presentations. Apologies for this already, it's up here. And maybe you might think that some of those things I've highlighted are things of leadership. Maybe they're not. But I can guarantee you, everybody and their dog is also telling you what you should be doing. There are so many countless thousands of books which continue day in, day out to explain what leadership's all about. And you fairly quickly realize, actually, like me, when you start doing the counting, I've acknowledged, or rather have catalogued, well over 140 different styles of leadership that you can be competent and capable in. And I hesitated to say hundreds of practices because that might actually be thousands of different practices that you might deploy or employ in your organization. And I'll talk about at least some of those as you go, or sorry, as I go. So there's a sort of question immediately of, well, okay, what is this great leadership thing there if there are so many of these practices? By the way, I think you'd be rather forgiven for thinking that there are only 2 or 3 styles of leadership. If we LinkedIn, I'll talk about that as I go a little bit further on. So then you start to look and you start to do some research and you discover stuff like this. That actually, when the performance of a CEO has been studied, typically the number that turns up is in single figures about the impact that they actually have to an organization. That cannot be attributed to luck, at least somewhere between 4 and 5%. This is a paper by Marcus Fitzer, well worth reading. So that doesn't quite square with this idea that these leaders are sort of amazing and there is this great leader. And then we all in this room been involved in changes. Arguably, it doesn't matter what the words on here are at all, where there's this wonderful moment of excitement. In this case, it's a brief capture of a flattening of an organization where everyone said, that's what we need to do, before the organization realized that actually we did need some managers. People weren't quite ready for the change, and it ended up going probably further back into autocracy than where it began. That's not unusual. And guess what? All the big companies agree. Well, all the big consultants agree. As a little bit of a kind of an early acknowledgement, the Deceivers in the title of my book come back to that as we go through. I think the big Reeves is probably better than the idea that 80% of statistics are made up on the spot. I think broadly that's what these are anyway. So this is kind of where I'm starting tonight's conversation. I began with this idea of this amazing leader. There's definitely a right way out there to lead. People keep telling me that there's the right way to lead, wanting to charge me money to teach me the right way to lead. So there probably isn't a right way. And then what I'm going to go through tonight is I'm going to hopefully take you on my journey. We'll actually dive into this and then, sorry, this is so cheesy, but give you hopefully an exit from my metaphorical roller coaster. I'm not convinced I'm going to do that, but I'll try.
Stephen, may I just interrupt you on that
You
one?
may.
I'm really sorry. I've been dozing. Stephen's keyword exit has reminded me. If you hear bells, there are no fire alarms scheduled for this evening, but you clearly need to for an exit. There's one back the way you can. This doesn't necessarily. There's another one over to the left through the atrium and at the back. They lead out into the street. And we'll meet again there. We'll meet again there. Meanwhile, if you need to go to the bathroom, the tree on the right, nothing to the tree, but turn right. The bathrooms are down that hill. So there you go. And on that word, I'll return the word exit to you.
Thank you very much. Well, that at least means if you begin to disagree with which direction to run.
I was just going to say, does that exit have at the edge of a cliff? Or does it carry on like?
Well, let's find out.
I'll wait.
I'm not quite sure. I did get some feedback, actually. Thank you, Thomas, because you mentioned it. My roller coaster no longer ends up at the bottom. At least it's at the top. But you're quite right. It could still be a precipice on the other side. So let's see where that goes. So I'm going to break the rest of this into a kind of a few chunks. Talk a bit about leadership, then talk a bit about delivery, because I think that's rather important too. And I'll piece that together with what I do about it as we go. So let's talk about leadership to start with. So when I started researching for the book, and actually for myself, I suppose, a place that seemed fairly logical to me was sort of, well, the leaders we know about. You know, these sort of public figures, the leaders of old. We disagree that some of these are leaders or not, but there's a key point from this, or rather there's two conclusions that come out of this. Either you study these kind of leaders and you end up in a position which is rather nuanced. You say, well, actually, some of what they did was brilliant, and some of what they did wasn't. So not pictured there, but popping him up here. Alexander the Great, who is continually named as this phenomenal historical leader, so militarily undefeated throughout his entire, and was responsible for spreading Hellenistic culture across what at the time was the largest empire known. So this hugely successful person. But we also know that he was somewhat a notorious drunk and had some really serious problems with alcohol. One example of that was being very drunk and in an argument with one of his closest lieutenants. They disagreed. He took a spear from a guard in the room and ran through and murdered him in front of him. So, okay, brilliant leader, but that's not so great. He had a rather dangerous God complex, arguably. Believed that his father was not his father at all. His mother had been struck by lightning, which was of course Zeus, while she was pregnant with him, and he was actually the son of Zeus. So that's sort of either side. But the way that leadership studies went, rather than sort of thinking about nuance, and I'll sort of pick this story up at the beginning, sort of the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, is this guy, Thomas Carlyle. Carlyle was a Scottish philosopher, essayist, and so on. And in his studies of people, the phrase great man theory is attributed to him. As it's described there, the idea is for your country or for your company or for anything else, all you've got to do is find the best man, and of course it's going to be a man at this time, put them in place and do everything that they say, and you've got the perfect place, the perfect starting point for whatever it is you're trying to do. That's rather different to the nuance, though. And I'm pleased to say that the nuance started to come out after Thomas. So this is a real whistle-stop tour of leadership theory. Okay, so we begin with this great man idea. You've got to find the right guy and give him the power. And then we move at the beginning of the 20th century into trait-based and then behavioral-based leadership. This sort of idea that you obviously want people with the right stuff. So a number of studies done. Here is one by Charles Bird, a book that he published in 40, which is available on archive.org if you want to read the whole thing. Quite a fascinating read, actually. It's not just about leadership. But in a study that he did, these are a list of traits that at the time, companies were reporting to him as being important. So we've got things on here from some things that we're probably quite familiar with, like initiative, through to things that perhaps less common. Neat, for example. We don't necessarily expect our leaders to be neat these days, necessarily. Fascinatingly, though, of course, when you look at the study of or count up the numbers, intelligence appears only on half of them, which already sounds slightly obscure for talking about leaders. Initiative 30% and 65% appeared only once. So broadly, what does that say about leadership? What conclusion can we draw from that already? Go ahead, please, just jump in.
I was going to ask the question is, I don't see empathy up there.
Nope.
What's that
mean?
I mean, not no empathy in the 1940s,
You have
perhaps.
to explain.
That's why I'm saying that
Means,
answer to your question, empathy. You can't empathize with the people who you're trying to lead. Might be difficult to do so.
Indeed, that's a trait, yeah.
Yes, Socratic.
Indeed. So effectively what the place that I'm sorry, rather patronizingly trying to take you to here with this is that, of course, when you talk to different organizations, they're going to tell you different things about their leaders, because depending on what that organization is, does, and so on, they're going to want different stuff out of their leaders. Of course they are. That just makes kind of logical sense, I suppose.
charisma, Dan. Need charisma.
So
It's not in the 1940s.
was charisma on there? I don't think it was. Cultured, fairly close.
Not in the 1940s.
But then, so to follow that thinking, taking over from this idea of trait-based and behavioral-based leadership, the most popular sort of style, as it were, of leadership, or the school of leadership that took over in the 1960s was contextual. And that makes a whole world of sense. If I just give you a very simple example, if there's a fire in your building, you want an autocrat. You want someone that's just going to tell you to get out of the building, just almost like Darwin just did. There's this event, you do that. We don't sit around and have a chat about what favorite flavor of ice cream we have, or what we did at the weekend, or do any of that sort of stuff. But likewise, if we're in a creative space, like we're thinking about product design and so on, then witchcraft. So context makes a lot of sense. There's one beautiful example, I think, of this, which is worth talking about, I think, or briefly noting. In the 1980s, so towards the end of the Cold War, the British government were doing some sort of war game to, what would happen in the event of a nuclear attack. And one of the papers that came out of the Home Office suggested very seriously that what we needed to do was identify the psychopaths in the country. So that we could get them.
Can you repeat that?
So there was a Home Office paper saying that we should identify psychopaths in the country.
Yeah, those.
Right. But the idea is, and it does make sense, this didn't actually ever get taken up, by the way. You imagine that sort of trolley problem idea, where you've got a choice between who you're going to kill and who you're not. You want someone who can close the door on the 10,000 to save the 100,000. Psychopaths are great at that because they don't have that sort of moral compass, as it were, that other of us. So again, another contextual use of leadership. That didn't go anywhere, right? That didn't end up becoming practice, but it is a white paper. You can find stuff about it on Unfortunately, though, contextual leadership isn't easy. Just as The way we just demonstrated by, I showed you a list of traits and you wanted to add your own traits into it straight away. And unfortunately, we're in sort of space movement. If you look on LinkedIn, you'd be forgiven for thinking that it's either authentic leadership, nobody can agree on, by the way, more on that later, or servant leadership, but no other leadership styles exist. Just as an aside, by the way, all of the LLMs think that you've got to be a West Coast Californian leader to be successful. If you ask them anything about leadership, the sources are all that stuff. They don't tell you about the other 40 odd styles. That may or may not matter though, right? Because there must be something to servant leadership if there are so many things written about it. So let's have a look at one form of it. Let's see where I can get you to.
Excuse me,
Please.
previous slide. So the mostly it's Western, previous one, Western recommendation will be given by about the
Yes, like ChatGPT or
code. Not so many papers translated into available on AI language from Far East, from East, from Asia, from anywhere else.
exactly.
Dominance of human language analyzed by stupid LLM. That's it.
Couldn't have put it better myself.
Nothing knows. Sounds.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'll come back to that again in a little while. Please go on.
I was being taught it didn't stick, but the things that I was taught goes against your contextual thing. In an emergency. When somebody says, you need to go that way, actually, I need someone who's believable saying, follow me. It's no good being ordered to do something if people won't follow you. So the person has to be believable. I know the way out. They will lead them out. I suppose the prime example of that is the Poseidon adventure.
I'll come on to that a little bit later.
Well, that's called leading from the front.
I'm just called leading.
I'll come back to it because this is kind of the point that I'm coming to here. Is in a way that nobody can agree on what any of this stuff is anyway, but it gets worse than that, and I'll allow me to get a little bit further.
Leader, you have to have followers.
You do, and I'll come to exactly that point a little bit later on. If I pick up on one type of servant leadership, because by the way, there isn't just one type of servant leadership out there. It depends on which book you read. This in a 2015 book by James Slight and Don Frick. It's these as the traits that we need. Remember, back to traits. So to be a servant leader, you've got to do this stuff and then you're going to fly. And some of it maybe you can understand straight away. Maybe leads with moral authority. I sort of always have a little bit of a challenge with, but still. That appears quite often in servant leadership stuff. There is only one paper I found that really legitimately studies servant leadership and its efficacy, okay? And I'll just briefly describe the conclusion of that here. And it was based on the idea of, or rather it was described through the lens of trust. So we all understand that trust, like the gentleman just said there about followers, a follower isn't going to follow you without some sort of trust. This paper broke it into two, cognitive and effective trust. And just briefly to explain what they are. The cognitive trust is based, as it sort of describes, on a leader's ability. So think of sort of classic artisan leadership. I believe that the person I'm listening to actually knows what the hell they're talking about. Often very important, the technical one. And that helps create task performance. So the quality of work being done, as it were. The second type is about concern and care, which is the effective trust. And that creates individual performance, which comes in the form of sort of motivation, and this OCB, organizational citizenship behavior, trips off the tongue, right? Which is basically, are you going to care a bit about the organization that you're part of? Are you going to see and act on things? Any guesses already about what servant leadership does? You think it affects one or both of these?
Affective trust.
Right, effective trust. Servant leadership, when studied, does nothing for cognitive trust. A bit of a one, because surely we want some task performance in our organization as well. It gets slightly worse because when studied, it seems that cognitive trust tends to be a precursor of effective trust. So for you to start thinking, I really care about this organization, you first need to establish that you believe that your leaders know what they're talking about. So suddenly that doesn't look quite so good. In that is that other leaders in your organization can offer the cognitive trust. For example, if you've got sort of technical leaders alongside human leaders, as it were, at the same time, perhaps we can get things. This is just one paper, and this is kind of the challenge. How many times do you see things like servant leadership talked about, saying that this is the answer to absolutely everything, but yet we've got actually very little evidence of whether or not it does what it says on the tin. But apart from that, step across to delivery. Remember, this is the putting you down, it's the oh my bit. So I need to lay this on a bit thick for a while. So when I was talking about delivery to start with, I was given this sort of view of the world. Right? That if you have good quality inputs, many of you might be familiar with this sort of idea in here, I'm sure, but good quality inputs and you have a good process, then that's all you need. You're going to get a good outcome. And it was taught to me actually in exactly that way. Quality plus quality equals quality. If any of you are familiar with Kepler-Trigo, they used to talk about this quite often too, that a quality process plus quality ingredients is a quality outcome. And maybe that makes some sense if you were sort of making a pizza, for example, or a loaf of bread, as I was describing there. You could even extend that fairly readily to a slightly more complicated process like this one. So we're still producing our bread, but rather we perhaps can control all of these elements to get somewhere. So that maybe the Q plus Q equals Q thing works. The challenge in our history, of course, came when you wanted to do things like this, build a cathedral, or in the sort of modern case, deliver some international program or whatever it is. Suddenly it's rather hard to control all of those little elements along the way. So our medieval forebears, both in Europe and also in Asia, not just in Europe, came up with this cracking idea of guilds. And we're probably all very familiar with this idea. You've got for example, a miller or a baker guild. What we do is, rather than assume that every individual will try and control their quality everywhere, we've sort of farmed that out, if you like. The Bakers Guild will control the quality of what the bakers do, and it will also give the individual bakers some rights. Arguably, this is the beginning of sort of unionization and that sort of thing. This is about controlling work and the relationship between the workers and the suppliers. And this was the sort of way of controlling quality. This comes right back to the late 1700s, but this is, well, sorry, the late 1600s. This was in a book by Becker, who talked, he was someone who was trying to codify the effectiveness of these sort of practices in, it's described as a laboratory plan, but it was any kind of manufacturing that he was recommending there. And it's a very familiar sort of idea, right? We've got someone at the top who actually understands what needs to be done. They write the instructions. The person in the middle, classic middle manager, don't need to know what that is, but their job is to make sure that the laborers under the lowest form of social rank do what they're told. That sort of idea, as much as I'm talking about this as a late thing, has continued to move into our sort of modern thinking. I will bring this more up to date. People in the room familiar with Winslow Taylor? I'm sure Taylorism is something talked about. Indeed so. Taylor is the, although perhaps not, but one of the originators really of the idea of scientific management, the idea that you can, if you can study what people do well enough, you can control it. Back to the quality plus quality equals quality. That point about shovels, to quote him, the average man would question whether there is much of any science in shoveling. But his point was, or his discovery, hence that description, was that if you controlled the size of the shovel for the material that was being moved, you could increase efficiency. And it sort of makes sense. If you're moving snow, you obviously want a big snow shovel. But if you're moving iron ore, then if you use a shovel like that, you're going to tire very quickly and inefficiency and so on. So that was him. Moving forward, the best part of 100 years, though, into General Motors, that idea continues. This idea that if you just break everything down to its component parts and control them, quality will come. So that idea continues, a little bit, unfortunately, like great man theory continues in both our business, professional and political world. This continues too. And that creates some changes, though, because when you can't control, you end up with stories like this. This was somewhere towards the end of the 1980s. I think it was Wiltshire County Council, somewhere west, anyway, or moving west, where a local authority had booked some Morris dancers to come and, no relation, but booked some Morris dancers to come along and attend an event. And the council wrote to them and said, can we have your ISO 9000 certificate, please? They, of course, didn't have one, so they were cancelled because this came from the Conservative government at the time, an edict that if you wanted to supply government, you had to be ISO accredited. Or you get things like this in a company that I worked for a while because of, actually this is sort of the other way around, but because of an ISO 27 non-compliance, we had someone who for many months was printing a stack of paper from the financial app, whatever it was, and then would shred all but one page of that because they didn't need any of that other data, but leaving that paper around caused a compliance problem. So instead, that was now the habit. We were now shredding sort of 19 sheets of paper for every one we wanted. So that was happening that way. But we've also got, at the same time, this guy. And I pick on Deming just because he's one of a few that had a different idea through this. Has anybody read Deming's books?
I do. You know, I simply rang because there was somebody here who was
Put him here
asking
really
for
as just
you
the counter-
because he
Well,
wanted to
it's right.
come to your event.
Saying rather than the people being the problem and the
And
control of the
we
people being
pointed
the
out to
problem,
him that
we've
your
got to control
event
the
is
systems and
actually
the
on the
process
5th of
instead.
November.
That's where it is.
So
And
he's coming to, so he's sitting now.
his book, which is,
The one we've got tonight.
I've lost it.
Yeah, that's.
I don't remember.
No,
I have the crisis.
that's all
Excuse me,
right.
that's embarrassing.
You know, you've got
Great.
the event coming up on the
Lists
9th.
14. It's very worth reading the whole book, by the way. But things like this, instead of inspecting everything, like that shredding kind of problem, let's actually help people to understand what the process is all about and allow people some initiative for themselves. You know, leadership, coaches, not judges, etc., drive out fear. And so on. All this idea of psychological safety being something new that Google did. Yes. Or, and this sets up for me sort of a dual philosophy you get in organizations. And I always get some disagreement on this slide. Right? I look forward to that. But two broad philosophies that organizations tend to have. Either tailor, care about the management of outputs, and we're interested in controlling the work and being very scientific in how the way we manage things. Or we're interested more like Deming in enablement and trying to push people the other way. I've listed some things in here, but truly adaptive project management, for example, truly adaptive project management, I would say sits on this side, giving people space to act, to operate, and so on. Where on the other side, as I say, we're trying to control what it is that's going on. There's a reason why I'm describing this, by the way. Michael?
On this slide, on the left-hand side, at the bottom, you see desire to manage is more management of, not about management in general. I manage only outputs. Everybody else must comply with quality I put at the end. I have
Yeah.
outcome, I have results.
Yeah.
On the right hand side, I have a process. In your process is no outcome or bad outcome. What is that? You see? Desire to enable more important than what? An outcome?
So, okay.
Sorry.
So the desire, so what I'm talking about is the general disposition of an organization. So here, the management, the executive team, believe that all the people don't know what they're doing and they need to be controlled, that hand side. Or we believe that that people are capable and we want to get the best out of
That's
them.
exactly the
Right.
point I disagree. Because you've called it management of outputs. I don't care how people do it. They have to deliver outcome I decided or somebody decided. I don't manage people. are free to do anything on the left. Yes. I don't manage people. Don't manage how they do it.
In which case you file would be more that side. Then.
No, I control output. I don't control people. This part controls the process, DevOps. Hello. I don't care how you automate something which makes no sense after you automated it.
Sure.
That's the point.
And on this side, the person, without going too deep into it, because this is sort of intentional.
It's about what?
This is sort of intentionally contentious
Oh.
in a sense. Because what I'm effectively saying on this side, if we've got a team of engineers, for example, this side, we give them the keys to the kingdom. They can also define what the outcomes are for themselves and deliver them. The truth of the right-hand side here.
You don't see above at the corporate level.
It depends on the organisation.
They solve it.
It depends on the organisation.
Depends on the quality of work.
Be our next speaker.
Depends on the quality of the workers. Are these sort of
Exactly right.
graduates or just manual workers?
Completely. So there was a famous theory in the 60s for this, McGregor's X and Y theory,
Yeah.
where we say that there are some people we can trust and we can just let them get on with it, and then there are other people that we don't. Some organizations, if you look at spiral dynamics, for example, which I'm not talking about, and Teal and all this stuff, the Frederick Laloux stuff, if you've ever read that, is all about removing all of the control and allowing people to do what they like, from setting their own pay to setting their own outcomes, the whole lot. But exactly as the gentleman at the front said, that's about understanding the capability of the people or having the right people.
Are you, and you may be getting onto it, so I don't know, but this seems to me to be kind of alluding to Toyota and the big Red Bull.
Possibly. Deming, of course, had some activity in.
Deming also was in that phase, but Toyota are the ones who implemented it.
Indeed, indeed. Well, I think he tried to bring some of that stuff to Ford in the US. It did fairly well. But one more, and then please might move
I
on.
think particularly public service, they do have a real, they can actually enable people in leadership, really enable people in public service.
That's probably a separate presentation in itself. I'll be optimistic and say yes. Whether or not the people or the leaders that are trying to do that have the capability to achieve it, is maybe the question. If you'll permit me to move on. The super patronizing summary of this is kind of that, which is that some organizations will treat their staff more like sort of the obedient dogs on the left-hand side who just need to do what they're told and follow the process. We care about we measure the work you do, not the outcomes you achieve. And then on the right-hand side, excuse me, that's my one and only use of AI in this, and pardon me for doing it. It is rather sweet, right? Can I just make make everything that I've just said sort of relevant, but rather more treacherous? I'll give you an example, a few examples actually. If you imagine this as hypothetical view of a DeLorean here rigged up to a torque meter. So we just want to understand its rotational force, and we can measure that very effectively with the torque meter. There is a known equation to calculate the torque, and that's actually an accurate number based on its performance, right? So what we can do here is we can measure that torque of that vehicle reliably, repeatedly, and know that we've achieved that number each time. Following that same sort of logic, and this is my flight fancy, I suppose, we can stick a flux capacitor in that, which I've got no idea what really does, but we could measure the difference that change makes to that particular system, and therefore say, yes, conclusively, that's improved our power. We do that sort of thing in some industries. If anybody's got any familiarity with the pharmaceutical industry, for example, there is a huge amount of regulation involved in producing and releasing the drug. I'm not going to go through the detail, but we start on the left-hand side. With a bit on the left-hand side is probably the easy bit about working out what the target is. We want a cure for this or a solution for that. The lead discovery, though, might take thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of molecules that go into effectively a huge amount of trial and error and testing and testing before finally we get to an approval and then a drug into production. Theoretically, I was going to say something I normally say, which is to say that paracetamol could be taken off the market if we discover that it did something wrong. That was assuming this rather than someone like Mr. Trump deciding that it was the cause of something much more serious. But anyhow, the point I'm trying to make is it's a very rigorous process. How well do we reckon the stuff in the leadership world is discovered by comparison? I could talk about this stuff all night now. I won't, I promise. There's only a few examples, but Tuckman, forming, storming, norming, performing, that stuff, everyone's been taught that. I've been taught that on every course for leadership I've ever been to. That was discovered, or rather written, by Tuckman, studying his own team of naval medical researchers in the 1960s. And he even put in the paper, I haven't got the quote here, but at the end of the paper, which I guarantee no one who taught me had read, he said, this is relevant for my group, it probably isn't relevant anywhere else. But of course, it's made its way through to the world of production. And we're told that if you've got some challenges in your team, you'll see this stuff. Consulting here quite often, but my team hasn't started storming yet. So of course that's going to be happening. By the way, if you ask, back to the point about LLMs, if you ask any of the LLMs about team formation, they quote Tuckman.
You'll quote Belbin.
No. Or, well, we know probably about Belvin as well. Can I give you one more that's a little bit more controversial, maybe in this space? The Agile Manifesto, anyone? I certainly don't want to diminish the capability and the tacit knowledge that the 17 guys in the ski lodge in Utah had at the point that they decided that that stuff was important. And I would agree that there's some really sensible stuff in there, but comparing that to that drug development, or my silly DeLorean thing a second ago, and just assuming that therefore it's going to be successful in your organization, I find that's a bit of a challenge. Just to pull up though, when I moved out of my sort of IT world into leadership, I produced this. I still own the trademark for the Open Leader method, which was my leadership framework. If you do this, you'll be fine. But of course, as I started thinking about it, I decided that, or discovered that that's about as shaky as everything else too. I would argue that there's some good stuff in there. Sure. Will it work for you? No one. And no one should ever be able to say that it does.
You mentioned an expression which harks back to a much earlier slide where you're talking about the baker. You mentioned tacit knowledge.
Mhm.
And there's a famous Toshiba example of tacit knowledge, which you may not know, their baking machine, where they had an analyst go and talk to the baker so that you could put the flour in at one end and the water in at the other and get a loaf out at the other end of the machine.
Yeah.
And all they ever got were bricks until they did what was called an ethnographic study. They sent the analyst to live with the baker.
Yep.
And then he got all the knowledge which the baker never even thought to mention. That's it, knowledge.
A moment to quote David Snowden for that is that you know more than you can say, and you can say more than you can write down. And yet we try to convey knowledge in writing. Exactly as you say, the iceberg doesn't do it justice. Just a point, by the way, as a general thing to take away, with any of this stuff, if it rhymes, it probably is false.
I love it.
So it gets you into this sort of awkward place, though, or it got me into this awkward place to say whether it's the forgetting curve, which was developed by one person on his own in his lab in 1880 that we still talk about. My son was taught about this when he was revising for his exams recently. It was gospel. No, it's not. None of this stuff has got proof. Gets a little bit worse, though, because if we take this hypothetical situation where we say, Agile, for example, we're using an Agile team uses an Agile practice, pick one, whichever you like. They've got a set budget and they produce a result in 10 weeks for 450K. Wonderful. But the team, because they just want to test the water, they decide to do it again, use the waterfall practice. And they've got the same budget, same time, and it turns out cheaper and quicker. Hang on a minute, I didn't think waterfall was supposed to be any good. You can't compare them. Thank you. Because that team have changed between those two experiments. They've got more knowledge, more capability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that puts you in a really sort of awkward place where we don't have a wormhole to go back and find out what would have happened if we'd been the different person or the different leader. The way to illustrate this is John Doerr's book about OKRs. people, I'm sure there'll be a cats and dogs sort of argument about OKRs in the room, no doubt. The subtitle to the John Dawes book was that how Google, Bono and the Gates Foundation rock the world with OKRs. So you'd be rather forgiven for thinking that this is ambrosia, you know, this is something you can really use in your organization. But based on what I've just described, if that was the revenue to 2023 of Google, we can never know that Google without OKRs, they could have gone worse, sure, but they could have been much, much better. There's absolutely no way of knowing. We've only got one reality. And this is kind of the challenge with the social sciences. No matter what it is you do, is unproven, and a lot more is unprovable. A bit of a, I think I'm close to the bottom of the oh my part of my roller coaster here. We're okay so far. I'm going to talk a bit about followers, actually. So why do we do this stuff? And the way I looked at it was by going back a very long way. I know I've been in the 16th, 17th and 18th century so far. How about 31,000 years ago? So just because there's a cave painting. So our understanding of leadership, and specifically as followers, why we follow a leader, is broadly based on this equation, which clearly is nothing that we ever do consciously. But if we imagine that we've got a small group 30 odd thousand years ago, and somebody wants to lead a hunt, for example, then we know that the person who's going to lead that hunt is going to get more of the spoils. So they may get the best thing. This is like the king, as it were, at the front of the army, or whatever. They get the money, but they also potentially have got greater dangers to themselves. There's a, if a person doesn't follow, they may risk being isolated, or they may not have the skill to lead themselves. So let me, well, that wasn't very clear. Come back to that. Do you imagine I'm making a decision to follow someone else? If I lead, I'm going to get a better reward. If I don't, I'm going to have less danger to myself because someone else is taking the fall, as it were. The person in the shiny armor in front of the opposing force is going to get hit with the arrows before me. There's no risk of isolation because I'm following someone else, and I may just not be good enough to lead. So this is a sort of a calculation, as it were, that's going on in our minds. If we imagine that situation, though, and this is part of the challenge in a modern organization, with a small group, we may discover pretty quickly that the leader isn't right and things might move around. You know, the leader that led that didn't do very well, so someone else steps into the fray. Modern organizations, unfortunately, most of the time, we are so far away from the people that are actually making the decisions about the direction we're traveling in, it's almost impossible to make that judgment. And inevitably fear sort of steps in and we worry more about the bottom bit perhaps than the top.
In terms of risk, a modern CEO, if they mess things up, they still get away with N of millions. They don't have to work again.
So thank the consultants for that one as well, teaching leaders how to take as much out of an organization as they can. So just a few other reasons just to kind of describe why this stuff happens. So we might be, keep that sort of follower thing in your head for the moment. If you imagine that you've got an idea, so you're a middle manager in an organization, you may have brilliant experience, very tacit knowledge of the work that's being done, as well as a real understanding of the contexts around you that you're trying to work with. You're very sensitive to what's going on and so on. But if you step out of your comfort zone, as it were, and step up back to that thing about risk, the results are going to be on you suddenly, and you're of course limited by your knowledge. So it becomes very easy to say things like, well, I don't know why we're doing it. My boss said we should. That's a nice, safe way of existing in that equation that I showed you a minute ago. And unfortunately, the industry, as I said, the deceivers in my book, kind of play on these fears with us. The number of times I've had this conversation where someone has chosen to work with a consultant or a specialist because of their reputation. No one ever got fired for buying IBM. No one ever got fired for using McKinsey, even if the results weren't very good. Of course, you took that choice. And those groups, unfortunately, tend to be stacked very heavily towards marketing, networking, and selling over delivery. They just want to keep persuading you that that's the right thing to do. When someone says, well, you could go to the cheap guy down the road, but if you do that, you're just going to hurt yourself. You want to come and play with us, don't you? We're going to get there. And it leads to probably one of the greatest deceits in the world of consultancy, which is when you do what it is that they advise you to do, whether it be, yeah, you should use Scrum on all our projects, that will work. Somehow you leave that conversation thinking it was your fault. And it must have been something you did and we didn't even believe, which then enables the whole sort of cycle to continue again. Just as a brief insight, I suppose, this is the value just of the corporate leadership training market as we speak. So at the end of 2024, it was a little bit shy of $50 billion worth of value. So, of course, these agencies have got a lot of interest in taking your money and getting you to buy those things. So just to summarize, I suppose, what I've talked about. So it talks a little bit about, no one can really agree on what leadership is. You've got organizations, depending on their disposition, will use different types of delivery frameworks and so on. But whatever any of that we choose to do, most of it hasn't got any proof, and a lot of it isn't provable at all in the first place. Which I suppose in a way is good news, because it means no matter what you do, you'll never know whether or not it could have been better if you did something else. But that's a little bit dispiriting, I suppose. So to conclude what I'm talking about, we'll do a quick time check, Toby. Am I okay for?
Cool.
I'll just conclude just by talking about a bit of an alternative. So this is the bit that leads up to the precipice before that roller coaster car falls off the other side, right? From my conversation earlier. And this is a bit of an alternative. So I just want to play a couple of games with you. So I'm going to ask you first of all, just to take a look at that picture, please, of that child's very dirty hands. And somebody tell me what the missing letter is, please.
Bob. So it's you?
A.
So this is a sort of a cheap parlor trick, right? All I've done is I've shown you a picture of some dirty hands and this with the audience, you guarantee what would have happened, that people will say, yeah, of course it's an A. You do it the other way around and show people pictures of tomatoes or things like that, you're more likely to get U. This is a really cheap way of just sort of beginning to talk about context, that thing that was sort of abandoned in leadership studies in favor of one-hit wonders and trying to achieve something. So context, as we understand it, is the situation in which something happens. There is a context to the world around us, and we all sort of intrinsically understand that. Again, a little bit of tacit knowledge, perhaps. Some of you in the room may be familiar with some expressions of this, like Cynefin. Have people met Cynefin? So Cynefin is a way, broadly, it's not described like this, but I'll broadly describe it. That's a tool, for example, that we might use to look at a situation and consider the predictability of it. So if you imagine, as I've got things here, things on the right-hand side, they're very predictable. We can, when we put these inputs in, we're back to the Q plus Q equals Q stuff, we're going to get the result. Same thing every time. Brilliant. Even things that are complicated, like putting a satellite around Mars, is predictable. We understand the movement of the planets, we can do the maths, and we can achieve that reliably. As long as JPL agree with NASA on what the units are and that sort of stuff. But as you move to the unpredictable stuff, like introducing a species into an environment, this idea of bringing wolves back into the Scottish Highlands right now. We've got an idea about what might happen, but we aren't certain. And then, of course, finally, on the other side, you've got the stuff which is sort of really chaotic. So already, if you think about the work you're doing in that way, just that simple metaphor that I've got there, you can say, well, if we've got situations on the left, our ability to adapt as a team, and therefore the way that we lead our teams, hopefully, or rather we're aiming to be able to adapt more to what happens. This end of the scale, the ability to adapt is far less important because we're always going to get the same result. Why do we need to have a conversation about how we do it? We've got an answer. So we can sort of extend that a bit and say, well, if that's true, on one side, we're going to be right down in the world of really true experimentation. We just don't know what we don't know. We need people to play. And that's why I've described things like adaptive practice and empowering leadership at that end. We want to give people the space to think, to deal with stuff that end. The corollary, of course, is at this end, the best place we're going to be, or the way we should be thinking about it, perhaps in terms of things like fixed procedures, predictive practice, because using adaptive techniques at this end is just going to cost us a load of money talking about stuff that we already know the answer to. And at the other end, swapping it the other way, we're going to put risk into stuff if we try to plan too much up front. Just to kind of colour this in a bit, you just imagine a hypothetical list of actions, and I've just highlighted two, so don't worry about the words, but I've got some actions for a product launch. If we just took those and put them on this sort of scheme, we can say, okay, here's a disposition of the work that we've got. In this case, there's a sort of fair balance. We've got some stuff over there, like we've got one of our lead developers has quit. That's a really unpredictable thing. We don't know what we're going to do about that. But at this end, we've just got things. That maybe doesn't tell us too much, but if you imagine we do that exercise again, or, you know, hypothetically, if most of the stuff is at the unpredictable end, then that tells us something really important about how we might operate, because we want adaptive kind of practice at that end. If we use predictive techniques, we're probably going to land ourselves in a hole. And you can guess what the next slide is. Just the mirrored opposite of the same thing. So that's a kind of context. And maybe that's something to go on. Maybe. So another little game. And I'll just get you to do this, please. Imagine a lion. Can someone tell me what they were thinking about, please?
Safari.
Safari. What else?
Simba on
Zoo.
Pride Rock.
Simba on Pride Rock. Sorry, a zoo?
Age.
Age. Anybody have anything different?
It was in this room and about to you.
It was about to eat me.
Yeah, it was right there.
Wow. I'll have whatever you're having. Cat. There we go. I love this because, so what I was thinking about was that. But this I always find is such a fascinating thing. And I honestly do this with your teams or do this with your family. It's always such a fascinating idea. If I asked you beforehand, do you know what a lion is? Of course you do. Everybody does. But I say out loud just a simple question. Imagine a lion and everyone in the room comes up with something unique.
It's comic called a lion as well in the 50s.
Zach, one of the best ones of these I did this exercise at a group, and there was a guy that ran a cleaning business called Lion Cleaning. And for him, of course, it was his own business. So it can be anything. The thing is, if you extend this from something less mundane, and you say authenticity in an organization, or put the customer at the heart of what we do.
We call it a roaring business.
He really should. He really should. I'll let him know about that and credit you. But the thing is, this is immediately a challenge, isn't it? Because we might have a dispositional sort of thing of saying, well, some of our work is unpredictable and some of it's predictable, but we can't agree on what this sort of stuff is. It's actually more complicated. This is from a book by a guy called Naresh Agarwal, who effectively did an analysis of the papers and discovered that there are 15, or just his work, 15 different types of context. That little coloured, the sort of hands thing, just to colour this in, proximity and relevance. For example, I showed you a picture of the child's dirty hands, and legacy and determinant. That's all about you sort of the standards that you're likely to have, the things you're likely to suddenly mind. And a lion, you've got the actor's mind at the top. So what you personally believe. The point I'm trying to make, of course, is all of this context has an impact on the work that you're doing. And finally, gets me to almost the very end of it, which is lastly to talk about sense making. So sense making, who in the room, by the way, has heard of sense making or done something with sense making? Well,
Certainly I've heard of it.
so sense making is a simultaneously extremely simple and academically deep thing. People like Dave Snowden, Professor Dave Snowden, as of Nevin and similar tool. That is effectively a sense-making tool, but there are many other names in this space as well. What it is effectively about is, well, what it says on the tin. It's you're trying to make sense. You're lost in a city. You'll look for things to help you make sense of the situation that you're in. You wake up in a strange bed. Of course, well, that happens in Europe, right? Most of this stuff happens linguistically. This is how we've sort of evolved to make sense. And I won't go deep here, but there are three ways. The first is this idea of cognitive linguistics. So if you've never read anything by Carl Weick, I very strongly recommend that you do. One of his most famous phrases was, how can I know what I think until I see what I say? Rather obscure thing, perhaps to begin with, but if you've ever had the experience of teaching something, then realizing once you have just how much suddenly deeper you understand that subject than you ever did before, we do that same thing all the time as we speak. When you say something out loud to someone without realizing it, you're practicing and learning your own arguments as you are in conversation. But of course, you're influenced by other people too, by the narratives, the interactions, all the many types of lion that we've got in this room are going to influence what you're thinking about. Okay, in that situation we just had a second ago, I could just show you a picture of a chocolate bar and we now all have a sort of similar understanding. But when it's something more complicated, no way around it, you've got to talk to each other. So to introduce another person in sense making, there's another person worth looking at. Sadly, we lost Brenda Dervin a few years ago now. This is, I love this diagram, but this is the culmination of a lifetime of study. That's slightly unfair because there's so much else that she did. But to be this simple about it, you've got to really understand it. So Dervin was very interested in how people make decisions, how people make sense of situations in order to make those decisions. And she came up with this model. I'll just walk you through an example. So if you imagine, to begin with, we've got a simple situation where I'm hungry and I'd like to get somewhere where I'm not hungry. There's a gap in between. So I might have already some good ideas of what to do, in which case I don't really even think that there's a gap. I just get to the other side. And as far as I know, I've just, got a chocolate bar and I'm happy. That's based on me. That's based on my life world sort of context from earlier. But of course, if I'm not sure, then I'm probably going to chat to someone. Maybe there's a proxy for that. I might do an internet search or otherwise, but I'm going to look for something to give me a clue to get me somewhere. Just briefly to explain what Brenda Dervin was doing, if you imagine that you've got a system, think of user experience testing, or sorry, user experience development work. Imagine you've got 100 or 1,000 answers to this kind of question about how someone was achieving something, how they overcame a problem or whatever. That's fabulous knowledge to help us understand how we design work applications, but also how we communicate. More complicated one, perhaps, one that we've all got right now, maybe. The CEO wants to do something with AI, please. But what on earth that means for many of us means that we're likely to need to actually have some conversations in our organization, whether that's with the CEO, whether that's with industry, anybody else. How we can really use that, Dervin's work was a lot of it was sort of retrospective, it's an anthropological study, if you like. But how we can use that, just if you think to our lion example a second ago, for any given situation we're going to have in our organization and any given outcome and the gap in between, in this room, what we've got 25, 30 people, whatever it is, we're going to have 25 of those at each of those stages. Those different views. If we can, imagine just the situation here, and we can say that if we can maybe just have some conversation with each other, perhaps we can bring people in a little bit further and start saying that we'll never get to an absolutely perfect opinion, but we've got a better shared understanding of the situation that we're in. If we can then do that, I would argue, and I would assert to everyone in the room, we're then in a much better position to decide on, well, how are we actually going to do this then? How are we going to lead? How are we going to operate? So on, if we start to bring the sides in on some of that context that's floating around us. I don't know where I went now. Oh, I'm just going to show you some examples. Excuse me. So there are so many more of these, but as an example, as I mentioned Cynefin several times, we've got tools which exist out there already. We may not be thinking about them in this way, and I think this is sort of the revelation that I had. Was starting to say, well, if I want to understand the situation that I'm in the beginning of a program that I'm in, or in an organization that I've just started working with, there are honestly almost an infinite number of tools that we might use. All of these things are ways to have conversations with people. If you take the metaphor of it's very difficult to play chess without a board, what these things are doing is providing a board for a conversation. So I've got a few on situation on gap. Things like Wardley maps may give you a sense of that's about prioritizing a sort of a value chain, for example, which might give you some insight there. Or in the outcomes here, I've got another Snowden thing there with future backwards, for example. But all of these are about encouraging and enabling a conversation. Unfortunately, going back to something I keep saying, you're never going to know if whether or not you've done something else, you would have got a better result. That's just not possible. I would assert that if you've got a better understanding of the contexts that you're working with, maybe that's good. But of course, that's just the situational context, because alongside that, you've got the other types of context playing on you too, whether it be just a simple thing like a cache constraint. A simple thing with Agile, very briefly for a second, if you said that dispositionally, the work we're doing would be much better if we empowered all of our people, but the people that you've got in your team aren't capable of doing that, then that's a good conversation to be having. Not just assume that Agile is going to be your answer all the time. Excuse me, I don't mean to just kick Agile all night. That's not what I really intend to do, but it's worthy of a conversation, I think. So to wrap the sort of sides of that in a little bit, and maybe in a rather simplistic way, there is no such thing as a dream framework out there at all. So I would argue that a much better answer to the world that we're in and the journey we take is actually talk more with this idea of sense making, using some of those tools to gather context and therefore make better decisions about how you lead and operate in an organization. I'm sure there are likely to be some questions. So just before I finish, I was going to say it's one brief final slide. Please do connect with me. At the top, I'm doing a couple of, there's 2 dates there. I'm doing a couple of sense-making workshops, which are just 90-minute sessions. And one of the exercises is a Cynefin-based exercise. So if you've never used Cynefin and you just want to have a play with it and understand a little bit more about practical sense-making and kind of feel what I'm banging on about a bit more yourself, then do come along. Have a play with one of those. But I would open it up for questions, if that's okay, gentlemen at the back.
Addition, not a question.
An addition, go ahead, Mike.
Previous slide.
Sorry, people were taking photos. I'll come back.
Situation is great. I would add context. Context makes sense. Lately, different context, different sense making something. It's very, very tight. The situation in abstraction is not enough. It makes sense. It must be in the context.
So I'm using sense making as a way to discover context. So just like we discovered that in here, no one can agree on what a lion is, and that's a fascinating beginning to a
A
conversation.
lot of managers don't do it. They take sense because they order to make sense. That's it. Outside of any context.
Back to that, it's, you know, no one ever got fired for buying IBM or McKinsey or whatever. It's easier not to. Conversation is much more valuable. So I put that back.
Yeah. Have you done any studies on predicting people would make the best leaders? For example, the military, you've got Sandhurst and West Point, where they're training soldiers to be military leaders, aren't they?
Yes.
They eventually become generals, and some actually become president, head of countries and so forth, the best ones. Why can't we have an organization like that, but for civilians, to train people? Because we're very short of good leaders, particularly at political level. So, you know, everybody hates the governments because the leaders seem totally inadequate. We need to train better leaders. Have you looked at a study to do that? No. all this stuff's very interesting, but how are we going to get better leaders?
Yeah.
In all contexts, whether it's NHS, government, whatever.
So perhaps a point which I didn't explain here,
Hmm.
and I will answer your question more properly, is that my sort of sense of what a good leader, in inverted commas, would be, is someone who's able to do some of this sense-making stuff, so understand a bit about the context they're in. So in the military context, for example, you need a kind of leader in that space. Certainly, a military leader doesn't, a military leader is not necessarily the same as a sales leader. It's not necessarily the same as an emergency services leader or a business leader or whatever. So understanding that context. But the second part to it, as much as I kind of describe some of that stuff in here about method as being difficult to, we can't prove that it's valuable. We need to have some options once we've done our sense-making thing, as it were. So if we establish that it's a very unpredictable circumstance, we should have some tools in our tool shed that help us to. A challenge, I think, in government, and maybe elsewhere, and maybe I'll get out of depth very quickly here, is that it's not as simple as we've got someone who just wants to be a great leader and produce wonderful results. There are a lot of other contexts that are actually happening at the same time. Country is not necessarily the first concern of a politician. Often their own careers is quite high up in there, and they'll make decisions in that way. So maybe the interest in being a brilliant leader isn't quite there. I don't think I've answered your question entirely. Personally, I've not seen a study specific question. Come back to me in a second if you think I've just given you a bag of chips and no answer. I'm not sure where I'm going here. Sorry. I think this gentleman next.
I had a couple of points. One is that commonality pattern that I see in many styles of leadership is the lack of clarity on why decisions were made.
Yeah.
And so I think regardless of whatever style you have, I think it's really important to make sure that the rationale for decisions are captured so that anyone who wants to look back and understand why a decision was taken.
Yep.
Can actually understand that. But the other point I wanted to make in terms of sense making was that it reminds me very much your discussion of Stephen Toulmin's logic for argumentation in the way that he decomposes an argument, claims, warrants, backings, and so forth.
Yeah.
And I think that we would benefit a lot by applying some of Toulmin's philosophy to constructing an argument.
Agree. Great. I think that was a statement rather than a.
Well, yeah, I mean,
I would agree.
I want to throw that in, just see if
Yeah,
it
thank you.
I have one statement and one question. I think all these names of the methodology about leadership, I think they come together in the same thing. Years ago, I attended a leadership training. It's to do with transactional leadership and transformational leadership. Actually, it's like say it's the instruction one, tell people what to do, and then the kind of empower one, and let people have their freedom to choose, and then merge together. So what I learned from my leadership training was you need both. At the end of the day, most organizations will need both. So your two sides of the spectrum,
Nice place.
in reality, you can't just choose one. It doesn't work. You can't choose the 100% transactional or 100% transformation. Okay, this is my statement. And my question is, throughout your research of your book, have you done any research of successful leaders like Steve Jobs and Jensen Huang? What's their leadership style to make them so successful?
Sorry, I'm smiling. That wasn't being full diminishing to your question. Can I just reflect on your first point first, just to say that I really, that's the idea of, so situational leadership thing very long ago. And you might have met people like this thing, this idea that if you've got people in the team that are very experienced and have got more enthusiasm, and then you manage them like this, then if they're not, then you what to do down the other end. The challenge with all of that stuff, as I could say, positive in a sense of, yes, you're thinking about it, but all of that comes from this perspective, because you're judging someone and managing it accordingly. What I'm encouraging here is a little bit more of an open conversation and understanding, understand the lions in the room and then make those decisions together.
Transformational.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's not, like that sort of that early roller coaster thing that I described earlier, just telling everybody that there's a flat organization and you can just manage yourself now, inevitably falls flat because there are a lot of people that just don't have the skills to do that. And it would be useful to have.
Why I said we need both. We need.
The thing about brilliant leaders is a desperately difficult challenge because almost everything, like that CEO slide I showed you a little earlier, everything comes back to a retrospective belief about what somebody did. So, you know, if it was a successful project, you get interviewed by the press. Well, you know, what did you do? Well, I was my authentic self. And I operated in this way and I gave people all the space. But that's your own personal or the leader's personal reflection. And it misses all of the rest of that pie chart that I was talking about earlier. So I was talking to some people about Simon Sinek, for example, talking about how Apple, he links the success of Apple to the fact that they had this magical why in their organization. Right. But they also had a ton of other stuff, from the luck to the market presence to the people in their organization with the ideas to the fortunate conversation in a pub that led to a piece of investment or whatever it might be. And that's the same with whether you look at a Steve Jobs, an Alexander the Great, a Churchill, or whoever it is. There maybe are some things that you could say, well, okay, because that person went that way, maybe we got that result, but it's so difficult in anything. It's a nice idea that we can bottle what they did and therefore become the next Steve Jobs, but it's such a thin slice of the equation because there's so many other things happening too. Smacks, fine.
Well, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the dynamic between respect and fear. Because some leaders operate on fear, others operate on respect. And I'm sure there are those who operate on a blend of both. He's the boss, or she's the boss. Ultimately, that they want a lot of input from people, which is the respect side.
Excuse me, sorry. You're
Okay, let's talk
You
about
referring the question?
let's talk about General Patton. He operated on fear model,
Yep.
whereas Eisenhower operated on the respect model.
Yep.
Further on the respect side. So yeah, both great leaders. But Patton wouldn't have been capable of organising D-Day.
I think maybe just echoed some of what I've been talking about.
Yeah, that's I'm trying to just unpack that a little bit. Yeah,
Uh,
because some of those are brutal truths.
Yeah, so I suppose there are 2 points. I would say it feels right that, like in the emergency situation, you want the autocrat to organise stuff, or rather, like the psychopaths closing the door on people. It makes logical sense that that's what that might achieve that result. The challenge with whether it's Patton, Eisenhower, or any of those other people, we haven't got any. There's no control in that experiment ever. Anyway, we look at those leaders through that lens and say they were successful in whatever our measure is. They made money. They won a battle, whatever that thing might be. But it's any projection we put over the top of that about whether or not they're a great leader is utterly subjective, I would say, because we can't ever know whether someone else would have done better with a different style in the same position.
Yeah, in financial services, we have the senior managers regime, which judges people, I'm not quite sure how, as to whether they are fit, a senior manager or a leader of a financial institution. And I don't know what attributes they're looking for in that regard, but they will probably be looking for honesty as one of them, or something equivalent to it.
What with the silent diss? Yeah, I'm my experience of that, and in the conversations I've had, is that conversation about the traits and the capabilities of the person mostly come out when it hasn't worked well. So something went wrong, the project failed. Now we care about the capabilities of the leader. If you've got so many times, if a leader achieves some results, then we don't need to talk about it. It's the sort of that they did all this other stuff over here because they've got some results, and that's what we want in our organization. I'm saying the same thing. It's so subjective from all sort of different angles. I like to believe that certain contexts would be better with certain types of capability and certain types of leader and all that sort of thing. And that's how I choose to operate, and that's how I choose to consult with my clients. But exactly as I've described up here, I could never prove to you that someone else couldn't have done a better or a worse job than me because we've got no way. We can't go back and lead that team in a different way to see what would happen. It's just, that's physics at that point, which is a rather depressing conclusion. Please, Tom.
Who do you think is the leader in this room?
On me, sorry?
Who do you think is the leader in this room?
Really good question.
We are leader of our own life journey. That's my belief.
It's gone wrong then.
I'm sorry, I haven't answered the question. I'm just interested to hear what other people would say about the same thing. Who is the leader in this room?
I am.
Well, of course you are, Thomas. And I love you for it. Okay, you know, I'm leading, exactly. I'm Spartacus.
Everyone is leading.
So why the question? What was behind it?
Because it depends on many things. I mean, to be a leader, to think you're a leader, to consider someone to be a leader. We're talking about this the whole evening, and this is the question. So because it depends.
Entirely, it does. And then you step into the sort of human nature stuff. Whenever anybody stands at the front of a room, there's a broad expectation from the people in the room, unconsciously, that the person at the front knows what they're talking about. You know, that little sort of equation that I showed earlier, that's the sort of thing that is sort of going on in your mind perhaps at the same time. But I think that's a fantastic rhetorical question.
Yeah, but I'm just want to add that it's about saying that is leader almost always should be, you know, or people just exist without the leader.
So a personal opinion to throw in, even in an autocratic team where you've got a sort of an overbearing boss, my view would be you've still got things that happen in that team that are led by different people. So, you know, capabilities lead different things at different times. It's a lot more complicated than just, and this is kind of the problem. It's always leader, 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 leader all the time. But a team, just to your question about the Steve Jobs thing, Steve Jobs, yeah, sure, charismatic, very good at getting people to give him money to invest in things. But he wasn't responsible for everything else that happened in that organization, nor on the planet that he was selling his products into. There's always so many other things going on at the same time.
Just to follow on from that statement, Steve, so the implication of what you just said is that you really shouldn't be attributing success to an individual leader. So in other words, if we took the example of a CIO in a large complex organization,
yep,
then it no longer makes sense to to attribute organizational success an individual, because there's so many factors involved in organization success, including the capabilities of, in this example, a CIO. So then you get into a whole potentially into a murky world of how do you reward good performance if you can't attribute that good performance to an individual leader? And that throws a massive bomb into the whole HR world of risk and reward, development, and so on and so forth. Which it might make sense, by the way, but it's certainly a hard question to kind of reconcile.
You heard of there's no I in team.
Yeah, of course. Well, it depends. It depends.
Fire everything.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let me be autocratic and say, I am the leader and I'm going to end this meeting now. Do it in a very benevolent way. Two things. One, please join me in thanking Stephen very much.